Salutations! The first installment of Halo 2 Uncut was a huge hit, not with just the video, but also the mod itself. The development of Uncut has been a great training session for me as I've become more used to some of the other aspects of Halo modding, mainly in the scripting department. I plan to take what I've learned from developing Halo 2 Uncut and implementing it into Halo Reach Evolved when the Reach tools finally drop. I recently released the 0.4 update for Halo 2 Uncut, which includes various changes to Outskirts and Metropolis, introduces the next two missions in the game, which are the Arbiter and The Oracle, and changes some of the weapons, vehicles, and characters in Halo 2, including some new weapons altogether. The release of the 0.4 update also includes the first release of Halo 2 Uncut's tag pack. This will allow modders to use Halo 2 Uncut as a foundation for their own modding projects if they so choose. It also includes other variants of pre-release content that aren't in my version of the campaign. For example, regarding the poll that I put up a few months back that asks which variant of the carbine I should use, the fully automatic variant won out. But I included the dual fire mode in the tag pack anyways if you prefer to use that in your own mods. The same goes with the battle rifles and the plasma rifles. Halo 2 Uncut also includes new content from Alt Sierra 117, a very good friend of mine in the modding community who actually helped me get into modding back in late 2018. One last thing before we get started with the video, the newest update for the mod will drop alongside this installment. 0.5 will include some fixes as well as some new content that's shown in today's video, including a certain Easter egg weapon hidden somewhere on Outskirts. With all that said, let's begin. Shortly after the release of the first installment, I did some more digging in both the pre-release builds of Halo 2, which include the alpha and the beta, as well as through the tags that come included with MCC's editing kit, and I've made quite a few new discoveries relating to the weapons, vehicles, and a few of the characters. Beginning with the weapons, first up is the SMG. I mentioned how the suppressed SMG was more accurate when firing in short bursts, but it turns out that was just how the alpha build's SMG worked as a whole, and it wasn't exclusive to the suppressed variant. Both weapons now have nearly identical stats to each other outside of the suppressed variant's more sneaky nature. The SMG is also slightly stronger, and its projectiles travel considerably slower than they do in the final game. The plasma pistol standard projectiles travel slightly faster now like they did in the beta build. The beam rifle is slightly more accurate when no-scoping, uses less battery per shot, and each bolt deals noticeably less damage than in final. As for the weapons that are brand new to this update, let's begin with the carbine. This variant, which was featured in the Halo 2 beta, is a fully automatic rendition of the weapon compared to the final game's semi-auto version. It also featured a 36 round magazine much like the battle rifles, but the most noteworthy feature is the high kinetic force that comes with each projectile. The carbine can push smaller objects around and even stun lock enemies in place. It's pretty overpowered, likely why this was removed from the projectile's damage effect. Next up is the flak cannon, which takes after its Halo 2 beta counterpart. Instead of 5 rounds per magazine, it's reduced to 4. The weapon is noticeably inaccurate with sustained fire, and the projectile velocity is considerably higher. The main set of differences come from the projectile's behavior. The flak cannon bolts stick to any surface, and after 2 seconds, they explode. The last new weapon is a portable rendition of the plasma cannon that's mainly used by the grunts. Like the GPMG, it's obtained by destroying the mounted versions of these weapons. The one bit of evidence of this weapon's existence comes from a weapon tag reference in the Outskirts level scenario. Within this weapon palette, we see the plasma cannon listed, but nothing can be placed down when attempting to drop one into the map. Since we don't have an existing portable plasma cannon weapon to reference, at least one that the player can use, the way I have the weapon set up is similar to the plasma turrets in Halo 3 and Reach for the sake of familiarity. Moving on to the vehicles, first up is the Banshee, which will now be fully usable in the Arbiter levels. To recap on how it functions, both cannons are fired simultaneously like in Halo 1, and the Banshee bomb has a considerable amount of projectile drop compared to retail. The update also makes the standard bolts travel noticeably faster than they do in final. Next up are both the Warthog's chain gun turret and the mounted GPMG turret. The Warthog's chain gun turret is significantly less accurate than in retail, but the biggest difference is the inclusion of a reticle that spins when the turret is fired. This was a feature in the Halo 2 beta, and a likely reason for why it was cut was due to the fact the reticle itself would also move around on screen as it spun, which could cause motion sickness for those sensitive to that. This seems to have been fixed for the future versions of Halo 2. The Scorpion has received a few changes under the hood. The vehicle itself drives just a tiny bit slower, the main cannon has a slightly faster fire rate and the projectiles have a wider AoE, and the coaxial machine gun no longer has a build-up fire rate, is less accurate, and the projectiles travel slower. The Shade turret is like its Halo 2 beta counterpart. It has a slightly faster fire rate, and 2 projectiles are fired simultaneously with each trigger pull, but more importantly, it has a very different projectile. Unlike in retail, where it simply uses the Phantom turret's projectile, the Beta Shade sports a much smaller purple round that isn't nearly as explosive. Next, we have Alt Sierra 117's pre-release vehicles, which are the Phantom and Shadow. The Phantom is now a destructible vehicle like it would become in Halo 3 and onwards. There's an unused effect within the tags that is dedicated for Phantom destruction, and in Delta Halo's mission script, there's a script specifically mentioning Phantoms being destroyed. Meanwhile, the Shadow sports a brand new set of textures and shaders that make the vehicle appear like it did in the E3 2003 demo. The projectile effects also mirror its demo counterpart, using a light blue shade of color rather than the retail's red. Lastly, on the vehicle side of things, and what I think is the most interesting for this new update, we have the Wraith. It's no longer specifically referencing its alpha counterpart, and instead uses a rendition that was likely tested between the alpha and beta builds of Halo 2. The Wraith now sports a dual fire mode that functions similarly to the plasma pistols. Within the tags, there's an unused Wraith mortar projectile that travels noticeably slower and with more gravity than the standard projectile. This was meant to be the Wraith's uncharged projectile. The final game's Wraith actually uses the charged variant of the projectile at all times, despite not utilizing a charge-up trigger behavior. With all this in mind, the Wraith now uses the unused projectile when simply pressing right trigger, and when the user charges the projectile, it'll expel the further traveling round. Moving on, there's a couple of changes to 2 of the characters in the game. First up, we have Alt Sierra's Grunts. It sports a light blue armor light shader, which resembles its E3 2003 counterpart. The rank colors for the Grunts are also different with this update. If we look into the Heretic Grunts biped tag, it turns out there are rank colors for the minor, major, and ultra ranks that are different from the regular Grunt biped. These are not being used by the Heretic Grunts, since they don't use a color change shader like the regular Grunts do. The Grunt minors are a bit more of a saturated orange color, and you can see this in some of the promotional material for the E3 demo. The majors are a slightly more saturated red, and the ultras are a very light violet color rather than pure white. One more change with the Grunts actually pertains to the Heretics. They have a noise filter similar to the Heretic Elites that goes unused in the final game, and it's been restored for Halo 2 Uncut.
Need to change backpack. What, Arbiter?
The other character that's receiving an asset overhaul is the Juggernaut. Many people have been asking me to give this thing something to do after dying. For this update, I created a custom physics model for the Juggernaut, and I'll be giving this monster proper death animations in a future update. When developing the first set of Halo 2 Uncut missions earlier this year, I went through each of their mission script files for any cut content that would have appeared in the levels. However, there was one very important mission script document that I missed. In the data folders for Outskirts and Metropolis, they have their dedicated mission script files that are named after their map file names, but there's one included here that goes entirely unused: Earth City. This is a much older script document that depicts a time when both Outskirts and Metropolis were planned to be one mission rather than 2. Within this file contains a lot more unused scripted events than what was seen in the standard mission script documents, and for Halo 2 Uncut, I incorporated as much as I could into the newest update. Beginning with Outskirts, the first change is a set of dialogue between Johnson and Miranda during the Falcon evacuation scene.
Evac coming in! If you're bleeding, you're leaving!
You too, Sergeant. I'm airlifting armor and reinforcements into the city. My Pelicans need an escort that isn't afraid of a little hostile ground fire. Move the wounded to a safe location, then return to ship.
Yes, ma'am. Chief, good luck.
The reinforcements that come with the Falcon now include a female Marine, as she too has unused mission dialogue that will be heard throughout the level. Going past the Hunter encounter, we bear witness to what is arguably the most drastic change to Outskirts. The highway has now been restored. Big shout out to Killzone64 for modeling the highway, as well as Bartholomew for corrections and helping getting this modified BSP to light properly in MCC. In the Earth City mission document, this encounter was stated to have a squad of Covenant march in a single file line underneath the highway. Once you move underneath the highway, a group of ghosts were to drive above you, instilling a sense of dread for what's to come later in the mission. When the Jackal sniper begins to shoot at you and your squad of Marines, the first bit of unused dialogue relating to the female Marine can be heard.
The only thing worse than jackals are jackals with sniper rifles.
You could say that again.
The next one is a pretty minor change, but I discovered that there was a bunch of unused seagull flocks for both Outskirts and Metropolis. The first one is shown in the beginning of the Sniper Alley segment, and here are the rest of their locations for this mission and the next. Once we make it to the second part of Sniper Alley, we notice that this entire segment plays out very differently.
Watch out for more traps.
Oops. Quiet! This ambush!
They haven't spotted us.
Surprisingly, the components used for the accidental plasma pistol drop scene are still present in the scenario for Outskirts, but they're not referenced at all in the standard mission script document and are instead in Earth City. No Jackal snipers were mentioned in the Earth City version of this encounter, so that is likely a welcome change for a lot of people. The encounter immediately after this has elites, grunts, and even buggers attack you from the rooftops. Once we get through Hotel Zanzibar, we see one of the most insane pre-release encounters up to this point. There's a flipped over Warthog along with a squad of Marines taking shelter in the building's wreckage, but they're being pinned down by a Parked Shadows turret along with 3 plasma cannons. As the enemies are killed, 2 ghosts from the beach show up, followed by a squad of buggers, a second shadow carrying passengers, and to top it all off, a phantom flies by and drops off a wraith, which begins shelling the building. One of the grunts that comes with the second shadow is also carrying a flak cannon, making Outskirts the weapon's original introduction. If all of this sounds nuts, just know that on Legendary, 2 hunters would have been included in this mess. Vehicle options for this segment are doubled compared to retail, with the shadow and even the wraith being potential options for the player to utilize. I mentioned in the first installment that the Covenant gun towers have an unused destroyed variant. Now, it's been brought back with the towers becoming destructible in the newest update. Near the second gun tower, an unused squad of Marines has been restored, along with a plasma cannon grunt right next to the tower. The last set of additions to Outskirts are by this bunker in the following encounter. In the Earth City document, it states there was going to be a Jackal sniper and a shade turret on top of the bunker, while a squad of grunts led by an elite guard the interior of the bunker. We move on to Metropolis, and the first change is one of the funniest and most unexpected pieces of cut content that I've seen in the Halo series. After crossing the bridge and dealing with the first set of Banshees, a bunch of civilian cars that are driven by grunts with bugger passengers swarm your Scorpion and attack you. No, really. In the Earth City document, there's a Covenant squad dedicated to Uber chassis drivers, with the Uber chassis being the name for the civilian cars. I have no idea if this was a legitimate plan for the mission, or if this was just written out as a joke, because this was just absurd. Inside the flooded tunnel, there are a few more enemy types planned to be included in this rendition of the encounter, with buggers and grunts spawning towards the end of the tunnel. The last addition to Metropolis is a reference to Scorpions originally going to appear at the very end of the mission during the Scarab boarding scene. It states that Scorpions are going to ambush the Scarab, only to die to the Scarab gun. I was initially unsure how I was going to place Scorpions here while having it make sense. It's very possible that this encounter had a very different design entirely, since the script references this area as a boulevard, But this ain't a bowl of heart. So if we were to assume scorpions were somehow going to appear in this rendition of the level geometry, here's how I incorporated them. The Arbiter missions were interesting to comb through. Like with the previously mentioned Earth City mission script document, there's another one that depicts the Arbiter and the Oracle when they were one mission, Alpha Gas Giant. Quite a lot of the cut sequences in both Arbiter missions originate from this document. Let's begin with the Arbiter level. For both of the following missions, there were hardly any director's cut changes that I was able to find, with the one change being the inclusion of a gravity effect for this scenery piece that Tartarus and the other brutes walk on before descending into the mausoleum. Right before the phantoms drop off everyone, we could spot some strange flying objects. These are the space jellyfish, cut ambient life that would have appeared on this level. They don't really do much of anything and only have one idle animation, and they lack collision. They were cut because one Bungie employee called these animals preposterous. Not a lot of people know about this little flavor scene, but there's an event where two heretic elites are talking about their missing comrades, and this is actually present in the final game. However, there were going to be a few more lines of dialogue involving a heretic grunt.
Any word on our missing brothers? Still nothing. And given what we fear, I fear they are lost. Surely the Oracle will protect us. Perhaps, but its sentinels are too few. Better we protect ourselves. You grunts stay here. We'll call you when we need you.
They won't call.
A common theme for Uncut's rendition of the Arbiter is that Sentinels are going to play a much larger role than they do in the base game. For the very first encounter, if you're spotted by the heretics, they'll call for a squad of Sentinels to back them up. 4 more Sentinels will then spawn right in the next area with the energy conveyor belts. If you happen to get past the first group of heretics without being spotted, only these 4 Sentinels will spawn. During the elevator descent into the hangar bay, one of your Spec Ops Elite allies was meant to play a pointing animation, seemingly towards the Sentinels. The problem is he won't always point in the right direction, hence why it was cut out. We won't see another cut sequence until after the hangar bay, which plays out extremely different to the final game counterpart. Instead of a group of heretics, there are 4 Sentinels that are flying around in this room. Upon killing them, if your allies are still alive, they'll notice the newly added Sentinel emitter machines and ponder what their purpose is.
What's those?
Careful now. We don't know what those devices do. They're forging new sentinels.
Make more bad things!
Get a grenade in there!
Grenade! Make go boom!
Unlike in the final game where they first appear on Sacred Icon, the Arbiter was not only to serve as the original introduction to the Sentinel emitters, but this also serves as a tutorial on how to deal with them. While there are no leftover spawn points in this scenario, I know the scene was to take place here because it's referenced entirely in the early Alpha Gas Giant script file, specifically in the Underhanger encounter, which is what this room is called internally. Shortly after the Underhanger section, there was going to be a small chase sequence between you and the Heretic Leader. This Heretic Leader spawn point is not referenced at all in both the Arbiter script document or even the Alpha Gas Giant document. However, both the spawn point and the point set I used to have the elite run to were already pre-placed by Bungie. All I needed to do was make a custom script to have them move there. Considering this wasn't even mentioned in the Alpha Gas Giant document, this was likely cut extremely early on, likely due to this area being a transitionary loading point between two different parts of the level. After the next conveyor room, the heretic leader appears a second time to simply run through the door. Once again, the point set for this movement script is still present, but this time, the elite spawn is mentioned in the scripts, just disabled in standard play. The final heretic leader spawn outside has him use the pointing animation like that one Spec Ops elite did, but more importantly, he's being escorted by two sentinels as he flies off in his Banshee. The Banshee segment has quite a few differences, probably the most out of the entire level. There's a cut piece of dialogue from the Spec Ops commander that triggers after taking off in your Banshee.
Look sharp, Arbiter. They're putting up heavy flak.
If we go through the intended route to take on all of the remaining heretic forces, we'll start to come across a multitude of cut enemy spawns. The first one is shortly after the first two shade turrets, where two more shades begin to engage us. Elites will then begin to spawn in thin air as we take on more of the enemies here, showcasing the unfinished nature of this encounter. This specific area is where the heretic leader makes his escape in his Banshee and the Oracle, so it's likely that when Alpha Gas Giant was both of the Arbiter missions combined, the BSP for the area before the Banshee scene on the Oracle was loaded. This would have allowed for there to be geometry behind this door, enabling elites to walk through it. The other thing I noticed is that the naming scheme for this specific elite squad matches those of squads that compose of heretic grunts with fuel rod cannons, which I think this was supposed to be. So I revised this encounter to replace the carbine elites with flak grunts, and only had 2 of them spawn in total. Moving on, there are 2 instances where the player finds large platforms that typically have fuel rod wielding grunts charging after them. However, a pair of shade turrets have been restored on both of these platforms, and after the first 2 grunts are killed, sentinels will start spawning out of thin air from above. Further along, there's another squad of sentinels that spawn from nowhere, but 3 of these spawn points are placed in a rather suboptimal location. I doubt this was part of the original plan, but what I ended up doing for all these spawn points was have each of the sentinels come out of an emitter machine that's placed roughly where the original spawn points were located, just to make this section look cleaner. The last encounter of the mission has the 2 sentinel escorts that were previously with the heretic leader, ally with the heretics stationed here. Our last mission for this video is the Oracle. Shortly after the mission starts, the Heretic and Flood forces begin to engage each other in the next room, but the Juggernaut is now among them.
By the rings, what is that? Quiet. It's moved on. Quickly before it returns, let's find the heretic leader and finish him off.
These lines still play in retail surprisingly enough. My guess is either the Elite treats the entirety of the Flood as one unit, or Bungie forgot to cut these lines out. The encounter with the heretic leader's hologram plays out mostly the same, and I'll get to the major difference in a moment. But before I do, I like to point out a test script that I found when combing through this area. When the mission designers were setting up all the enemies in this area, there was a time when they didn't have the assets for the holodrone just yet, so they used a sentinel as a dummy to test a flight path for the drone. Instead of the Spec Ops commander hanging back to wait for reinforcements, he was originally meant to follow you and your allies to the elevator. When we approach the elevator, we'll notice our good friends the sentinel emitters again. There are 2 of them directly above your position, and 6 more await you as you continue to progress to the autoscaler section, with 2 emitters per floor. Another set of major events that happen during the elevator descent involves the infection form containment canisters that are embedded into the walls. Not many people are aware of this, but the canisters that are loaded onto your platform contain infection forms. As your elevator reaches certain floor levels, the canisters directly above you will burst open, raining down a bunch of infection forms onto your position and reviving any nearby combat forms. This will happen a total of 4 times during your elevator descent. Once you finally reach the ground level, 2 heretic elites will ambush you from behind, And after all the enemies are dealt with, the Spec Ops commander has this to say.
I do not wish to stay here any longer than we have.
Next up is the Flood Lab encounter. After the initial battle between the Flood and Heretics on the ground floor, a squad of Heretic reinforcements show up on the second floor. These appear in retail, but now that we have the Spec Ops commander here, we get to listen to some cut dialogue.
Heretics, above!
After the Heretics are killed, the Juggernaut appears.
Come! Prepare yourself, Arbiter! Right! It shrugged off our every assault! It must have a weak spot! Hold the eye, Arbiter! Aim for its eye!
Once the Juggernaut is killed, the rest of the Flood Lab encounter plays out as normal. Heading outside, there's an enemy Banshee that's trying to make a strafing run against you and your allies, all while dealing with your allied Phantom. We won't see another difference until the cutting of the cable section, where Heretic elites are posted here alongside their Sentinel allies as they take on you in the Flood. The final encounter of the mission, the Heretic leader boss fight, has one major difference that completely changes how this boss battle plays out. Sentinels and Flood forms will spawn during this fight and turn this into a three-way battle, with the Heretic leader and Sentinels fighting you as well as the Flood. This sounds like it would be a nightmare to deal with, and it can be daunting at times, but you're able to use the Flood as a distraction to get easy pot shots against the Heretic leader. And that's going to be it for this video. For the next installment, we'll be heading to Delta Halo to uncover the secrets that lay buried within the game files. If, and only if, you enjoyed this video and can't wait to see more episodes of Halo 2 Uncut, like the video, leave a comment on what you think about all of this to boost that juicy algorithm, and subscribe for more Halo content from this channel. I also have a Patreon where you can voluntarily donate to further support the channel. I'd like to thank my Sangheili Zealots, as well as counselors C3 Sabretooth, The Cave Potato, Broly Martinez, Just Larm, Joshua Fisher, Synonymous Hooligan, Sean T, Konor Daytona, Lauren Kleckner, Rad Mayan, Rosie Muscovy, and Kyle Dielman. This is the Vengeful Vadam. Always remember that you matter more than you think you do, and I'll see you on the great journey.